It doesn't feel good coming off of a negative review only to jump right into another. Most of the time, I like to try to provide a healthy mix of positive and negative opinions in every batch of reviews I make, though sometimes things just can't be helped. At least my previous review subject had the excuse of being an essential component for Hasbro's most ambitious combiner to date. Today's subject has no such excuse, and even worse, it has far more apologists. I didn't think this would be a controversial review when I initially set out to make it, but alea iacta est and all that, right? Welcome to Kit Katastrophe. My name is Kit, and today we'll be taking a look at Transformers Studio Series Leader Class Shockwave. This figure was released in 2019 as part of Wave 4 of the Leader assortment, and uses components from Studio Series' own version of Revenge of the Fallen Megatron. This figure represents Shockwave's appearance in the 2011 film Transformers Dark of the Moon. Given that Shockwave was never known to transform during all 2.5 hours of Dark of the Moon's runtime, instead opting to hide inside his massive throbbing worm to get around, his figures have always defaulted to a tank alternate mode, if you can call it as such. It's kind of tradition at this point that when it comes to Cybertronian alternate modes, enough liberties are taken to make an anarcho-capitalist blush, and Shockwave is no exception. When compared to Megatron or Shockwave's own 9-year-old predecessor, it's clear that the design of this terrestrial terror wasn't just pulled out of thin air. Shockwave's legs making up the sides are a natural carryover from Megatron's engineering, and the placement of the arms mirror those of the Dark of the Moon Voyager. However, unlike both examples, Shockwave manages to drop a fat deuce on the mattress by not even attempting to hide the hand and feet. Perhaps the visible feet could be excused as some kind of cowcatcher-esque guard on the front. There's just a huge mitt up top that looks like it's trying to grab his own head. Now, I'm not going to be too harsh on the visible face, as it's another carryover from Megatron, who used it as a stylistic choice in the film. I will be harsh on the reused mouthguard pieces that don't come together in any discernible and convincing way. The best I've managed is this, which is at the mercy of some rather tenuous friction tolerances. It doesn't help that the pieces are connected to the feet, which have no locking mechanism in this mode. To Shockwave's credit, the cannon up top is far more developed than those of either his mold-mate or spiritual ancestor combined, placed with such prominence and granted such girth as to make a typical Transformers fan feel somewhat inadequate. The placement of the large rubber blade is variable, and it can be removed entirely if one so desires, only to the effect of unmasking the hand even more. Around the back are 3 round pustules which appear to be some kind of propulsion system. I mean, that's a fair enough use for this part of Shockwave's robot design, though I prefer the original Dark of the Moon figure's creative use of them as wheels. As they are here, it feels like an afterthought. It seems to me that, a lot of the time, figures that reuse the engineering of another figure just don't live up to the original use, or at least seem to take fewer risks in making an interesting transformation. Shockwave is one such case. The legs swing down and the hips compress in exactly the same way as on Megatron, just without any of the swivels or fancy tricks to get them to look like legs, since they were clearly legs to begin with. The torso actually comes together far differently than on Megatron, though the arms come out in a familiar way, even if they are backwards comparatively. The rubber blade technically parts forms, but some people may see it more as just a preference in placement, as there are multiple 5mm ports on Shockwave's arms to accommodate it. The only real clever bit of this transformation is the hinge on the port connecting Shockwave's hose to his backpack. On the original Dark of the Moon Voyager, you had to unpeg the hose and peg it back in elsewhere in order to transform him, but it remains entirely connected throughout the Studio Series figure's conversion. Shockwave's robot mode is where over 60% of his apologists come from, and I'd almost be inclined to agree with them. Studio Series Shockwave is an extremely convincing and well-detailed representation of his on-screen model, with impeccable proportions and a good weight to him. I suppose the first thing one would notice about this robot mode is the rather stunningly massive cannon in lieu of Shockwave's right arm. It seems to me that a good chunk of the added leader class budget bestowed upon this figure went into making this weapon as big as possible, and yet it still seems perfectly proportioned. Just as Studio Series Megatron featured a movable thumb claw on his cannon arm, so too does Shockwave, which is kinda cool. The hose is long and flexible, having some nice slack when the arm is at rest, and not impeding arm movement like on the original Dark of the Moon figure. The legs are wonderfully sculpted and have enough curviness to them that you can just about get that iconic animated Optimus bodyline going through them. It helps that the ankles are extremely well articulated, though I see it as kind of a monkey's paw, as right out of the box, there's a mildly frustrating learning curve when it comes to balancing Shockwave correctly. More often than not, you'll be using the hero curve just to stand him up properly instead of getting a dynamic stance. There's also those mouthguard pieces dangling off his Achilles tendons, which look messy no matter what you do with them. When I first got this figure, I had assumed they could turn into some kind of heel spurs, but no, they're just supposed to float back there. Moving up Shockwave's backside toward his back, those propulsion pustules are displayed loudly and proudly. This was one of the design choices I liked most from the original Dark of the Moon Voyager, and I like them here all the same. The problem comes from the tolerances these parts rely on in order to be displayed properly. In robot mode, they're all supposed to be splayed out, while they all pointed backwards in vehicle mode, but the friction hinges on each of these pods have such uncooperative tolerances that more often than not, they'll just fling themselves back into position as if they were spring-loaded. The right arm is the quote-unquote normal one, graced with Shockwave's dignified digits. I'd like to take a moment and point out that the vast majority of Shockwave's plastic is actually a dull brownish gray with purple weathering applied over it. Meanwhile, a lot of the black rubber plastic is given a silver weathering. For Shockwave's sake, I hope this rubber is neither the kind that cracks in a few short years, as on the Robots in Disguise Autobots, nor the kind that melts other plastic, like on Revenge of the Fallen Bludgeon and Demolisher. Only time will tell, I suppose. Shockwave's normal hand features most of a 5mm hole, though considering how malleable this rubber is, it's probably best to keep that huge blade mounted on his forearm. Finally, we come to the upper chest and head, which, as always, are wonderfully sculpted. I love the ribcage motif, and I feel that Shockwave's head design is one of the greatest adaptations of a Generation 1 design into the movieverse. Honestly, I think Shockwave's design as a whole is likewise one of the best adaptations. It has pretty much all of the classic elements one would expect from a Shockwave, while at the same time it embraces the sharp and polygon-heavy aesthetic of the live-action films. Shockwave's first accessory is one which I've already mentioned a few times previously, his blade. It can be pegged into either the side or the rear of his forearm, and is made of the same rubber as is found elsewhere on this figure. Moving on, Shockwave also comes with what may be the single smallest accessories in the entire Studio Series line, 2 small figurines of Wheelie and Brains, each of which are about as tall as a thumbnail. Brains is awash in a coat of silver paint, while Wheelie's black plastic and red accents can't help but to blend into his dark blue coat. Due to his round feet, Wheelie can be a bit difficult to stand up, and both figures are just asking to be lost due to their minuscule size. The last accessory is a Paratrooper figurine attached by string to a cloth parachute. I know this specifically was included due to that one scene from Dark of the Moon, but I'd have rather seen the budget allocated to this go toward making the main figure better. Shockwave's head is on the same series of joints that Megatron's was. He has a ball joint that allows for a great range of motion, and it has a cut in the back to allow him to look straight forward. That's partially for transformation, but it does mean he can look up very far. The actual base of the neck is on another joint that allows the entire assembly to move forward, and there's another hinge on the joint connected to the stem for the neck ball joint that allows it to straighten up so he can look like this and frighten small children. These shoulders swivel forwards and backwards 360 degrees, and they move outwards 90 degrees. The biceps swivel, and the elbows bend just about 90 degrees. The hand has a little hinge that allows it to move inwards a little bit. It's not much. I don't really know why it's an option, but I guess I shouldn't complain. Like I mentioned, on the cannon arm there is a movable thumb claw, and on the back the attachment for the hose has a little hinge that allows it to move forward and back for transformation. These pods are on a friction joint, and they don't really like to stay in place, as I have already bitched about. The hips are Megatron's hips, and they can kick forward to an absurdly large degree, and they can move backwards very far as well. The thigh swivel I thought would be able to move 360 degrees, but apparently it does get stopped around here for reasons I can't discern. The knees bend over 90 degrees, and these knee pads do move inwards to smooth out the leg line, which is very nice. And they can come back out so you can unbend the leg. The ankles have a forward joint that allows them to pivot forward. They can move backwards. They can tilt an extremely far amount. And there are other joints inside that allow the foot to jostle about and move in various ways you wouldn't really expect. So, Shockwave is very well articulated. Of course, he doesn't really have anything at the waist because of transformation, and some people might find that a deal breaker, but I do not. I think Shockwave is a pretty well articulated figure for a Transformer, and you won't really have any trouble posing him. Initially, I went into this review preparing to rip and tear into this figure, but strangely, I've warmed up considerably. A lot of the points Shockwave supporters have are valid, mostly on how good the robot mode looks and feels. After an hour or so getting used to the joint tolerances, Shockwave becomes a lot easier and more fun to pose. The general aesthetics of the robot are to die for. As I've said, Shockwave is one of my favorite designs from the movies. Of course, that's not saying that I've fully converted. I still think Shockwave lies on the negative end of the spectrum, mostly due to the lack of any real vehicle mode and the lazy transformation. I recognize that most people who will buy this figure will display him in robot mode in perpetuity, but for people who want an actual Transformer, maybe this figure isn't for you. While I was expecting to rate this Shockwave as low as Ignore, I think he better fits the higher Tragic rating. If you liked this video or otherwise found it helpful or informative, then please subscribe for more reviews like this in the future, and feel free to suggest topics for future reviews in the comments. When we return, it's time for the big review number 150. But before then, I'll be posting a little recap video of all 8 Constructicon reviews in one. This has been Katastrophe. Transform and roll out.